Welcome to the webinar, everybody. This is a Washington, D.C. update. We are going to be covering developments in the federal policy space. This webinar is a One Voice webinar. It's a production of the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I know we have a lot of regulars on today and some newer folks as well. So let me give you a little background about who we are. On the webinar today, you have the team from the Franklin Partnership, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzek. Omar and John are the on-the-ground lobbyists here in DC for NTMA and PMA. On the webinar from the Bracewell side, you have me, Caitlin Sickles. Usually you would have Paul Nathanson as well, but he is on a well-deserved vacation today. We are the advocacy communication team representing NTMA and PMA and amplifying the good work by Omar and John in media and on social media, other contexts. Much to cover in today's webinar, but one logistics note. Thank you everybody for joining us on Zoom. This is our first Zoom webinar, having moved away from GoToWebinar. So if you have questions for us, there is a Q&A box on your screen. Hopefully you can see that. Please do type your questions in there. Much to cover on content today. We'll talk about what's going on in Congress, give you an update on regulations. We'll talk about some trade and tariffs issues. And then we'll talk about some of the much-watched Supreme Court decisions that have come out this week. It is the Friday before the 4th of July, so you can count on your federal government to be dropping off major announcements this week, and no surprise there. So we'll cover some of those things. This is a new slide we've been adding in on the last few webinars where we tell you sort of a quick hits of everything we're going to cover. Quick, sort of, lots of bullet points here. When you see this after the fact, it's an easy way to look at the slide decks and be able to see, is this the deck that I was looking for to cover these different issues? So lots to cover, as you can see. This is everything we will touch on briefly in today's presentation. Moving from here, I know we're going to start with Congress. I think we were having a few audio issues with John. John, if you're back, I'll turn to you. Otherwise, we'll start with Omar, and I know that John will jump in. So, John, if you can hear us, go ahead.
Yep, when I see John jump back in as a panelist, I'll hand it back over to him if we're still on Congress.
Perfect.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yes, we do have a bit. We're going to run to probably around 12:40 Eastern, just because of the Supreme Court decisions that just came on that Caitlin referenced are going to take a little bit of time. A quick update from the Hill, though. The House and Senate, they are just, obviously they've been gone for a bit. The House has been in this week. The Senate has been out. The House just a few hours ago passed a virtually Republican-only Department of Defense policy bill. We refer to it as the NDAA. That just cleared the House. The Senate worked through the committee process recently as that. The House is scheduled to move, or the hope for the Republicans in the House is by the end of July to have all 12 of the federal government spending bills completed and sent over to the Senate. The Senate, for their part, was trying to move forward to at least getting through committee as many of the appropriations bills as they could. So I'll turn over again. If John's on, jump in, John, because I hadn't seen you as a panelist.
Yeah, so I mean, they're not in much. The House and Senate are not in much, largely because of July 4th. But also the other significant issue that's coming up is the Republican convention in Milwaukee, which starts the week of September 15th. So that is why. But there's, as Omar said, there's still a strong push to get the appropriations bills done. We're still hoping, as Omar said, the National Defense Authorization is moving, and we're also hoping that the Senate will continue to move forward on the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act sometime in July. But again, the days that they are in session is somewhat limited. Going back to what we've been talking about in the past several webinars is what's the latest on the tax update. Senators on both sides of the aisle are trying to put pressure on Senator Schumer to bring the tax bill up for a vote. That is the bill that we've talked about in the past, which fixes RD, does 100% bonus, 100% expensing, and business loan deductibility. They're still pressuring him. I was at a meeting, a tax team roundtable this past week, where folks who have been very supportive of the House passed overwhelmingly House-passed tax bill, was extremely frustrated by the Senate's inactivity on that tax bill. But as I mentioned, the House and Senate, the House has developed tax teams, as we mentioned in the past. The Senate has done working groups. The tax writing committees in the House and the Senate are meeting. The Republicans are meeting, Democrats are meeting, trying to figure out what they want to do next year when it comes to passing some sort of tax bill. So that is the latest. The House tax teams are holding field hearings. As I had mentioned, there was the first working group that we attended this past week. That was very informative and very well attended. The one message that from the members who were from the working group told the participants who joined that roundtable is they want data, they want facts, and that's what, when we do our surveys out to the membership, that's critically important. That's the details that they want moving forward on taxes. There was a discussion, and there's a bit of a disagreement between a couple of the members who participated in that roundtable. One member thought that the lame duck might be an opportunity to pass as the House passed tax provisions, but she was countered by the chairman of the manufacturing roundtable, who said it looks like it to be the first quarter of next year. So things are still a little bit up in the air right now.
Yeah, I agree with much of that assessment. Still sticking with this year's tax extenders, as we refer to it, for the R&D fix and for bonus depreciation. The timeline, there is going to be one more push again this coming month in July to get Schumer to try to move forward, as John mentioned. And we did start to hear, at least I heard from one person this week, that Schumer might starting to be willing to relent a little bit on that. So we still have one more chance there. As a reminder, I think Caitlin may have mentioned, we're on Zoom, so please do use the question and answer box. You probably can access it from somewhere on the top of your screen, and we're happy to incorporate any questions as we go through. We've got quite a bit to cover on the regulatory side and Supreme Court, so we're just going to run through and give you a few updates and then allow you to delve in most of it on your own later. A few things from the regulatory side. We do have the Department of Labor's apprenticeship rule that has been sent over to the White House, and that is under review. What you're looking at here is the official receipt by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that's referred to as OIRA, and they are the body that does the interagency review process. That process can take up to 90 days. This was received on June the 14th, and they have already scheduled, as you can see, a number of meetings with other stakeholders to address that. We, as One Voice, did file comments several months ago opposing their attempt at the Department of Labor to eliminate the ability to use competency-based apprenticeships in the registered apprenticeship models. And that's something that we'll continue to address there as well. But it is a final rule that is under review, so that we'll see what that comes out. We potentially could see something by the Labor Day holiday or so in and around there as well. Sticking with that, and I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin here in a second. But on prevailing wage and apprenticeships, this you'll want to note that this is from the Department of Treasury in coordination with the Department of Energy and relates to some of the funding that was included under the Inflation Reduction Act. As I've mentioned in the past, what you're seeing on the left are some of the tax provisions that are incentives for green investment, whether it's manufacturing for your product or manufacturing for your facility itself, and trying to, again, reduce some of its emissions footprints. Tax credits, number of those came with step-ups when prevailing wage was met and apprenticeships were met. Some of them are also exclusionary, meaning if you don't reach some of those requirements, you also are not eligible to receive the full credit. And the PWA means prevailing wage, and those final rules were just recently published, and those prevailing wage requirements are going to increase the credits by about 5 times. So if you are using any of those tax credits or incentives on the left-hand side, you should work with your CPA, CFO to identify some of the apprenticeships, registered apprenticeships that are incorporated and used, and the prevailing wage that's paid. And to that effect, Caitlin, I'll turn it over to you for this one.
Thanks, Omar. I just wanted to flag here a really nice interview on the Indicator podcast. The Indicator is an NPR podcast, part of the Planet Money show. And this was an interview, really interesting media request that we got, seeking stories of employers who post jobs and then leave them up for a long period of time, specifically looking for really skilled jobs. Allison Giddens from Wintech did that interview. Allison's great media volunteer, always willing to, participate in advocacy and advocacy communication. So we're very grateful to her. It's a really interesting story, reflective of both the challenge and opportunity of hiring skilled workers. So just a way that we amplify the importance of training, but also the high-tech, high-skilled jobs that are out there and the lengths that companies are willing to go to connect to the right people. So lots of thanks to Allison, and also good reflection of NTMA and PMA's work to get the story out there. Just wanted to share that.
Well, absolutely. And I think it's testament to the importance of the media and engaging publicly. And there's no better way to get the message out to the broader public and also to stakeholders here in Washington. So I definitely appreciate that, and thank you for pushing that out. And speaking of back here in Washington and around the country, a few things that we're going to discuss with regards to the heat rule here. And let me start off with California, and then we'll talk about what OSHA is doing. The California indoor heat rule was just finalized a few days ago, and we've been talking about this now for almost 2 years, I believe. Last year, they really stepped in and moved forward with their agenda. Out in California, they've already had an outdoor heat rule on the books for a number of years. This is an indoor rule that largely mimics it. On the next few slides, I'll show you screenshots of what California put forward as a comparison for the outdoor versus the indoor rule. But effectively, it applies to indoor work areas at 82 degrees Fahrenheit or more. And the control measures are required in 2 different categories, at 82 and at 87, especially when their individuals are wearing certain PPE that restricts the ability to cool themselves down. And there's additional requirements that you'll see. The board has approved it, and that was just done on the 20th a few days ago. The next step is the Office of Administrative Law, OAL, has 30 days to approve or deny, and everyone likely expects OAL is going to approve this, which puts the indoor heat rule in effect largely and likely in August, potentially is August 1st. The scope of it, and we're not going to run through all of it, for those of you in California, you should certainly look at it for details. For those of you not and anticipating a federal rule or potentially one to come to a state near you, this will potentially apply as a model to take a look at the scope when the indoor temperature is greater than 82 degrees. Note that the federal government is looking at an 80-degree Fahrenheit heat index or more, and this one is greater than 82 is where they're looking at, and then 87 and plus. With regards to access to potable water that is fresh, suitably cool, and free of charge, and location as close as possible to work areas and cool down areas is in the indoor requirement in California. Note at the federal level, they were potentially contemplating putting water at every workstation as a requirement out there. The indoor and outdoor have largely merged the same in access to shade and cool down areas, particularly those facilities that do have some kind of outdoor as well. That's where you'd want to take a look at preventive cool down rest periods, allowing workers who ask for a cool down rest period to take one, monitoring, blocked from direct sunlight in some of the areas. Outdoors, again, not much change between indoor and outdoor there as well. Where California does certainly go further than some of the other states and potentially could serve as a model for the federal government comes towards the measurement and the record keeping and the assessment there. The measuring of the temperature, whichever is greater, the 87 or 82, where workers in clothing that restricts heat or high removal or high radiant heat areas, that's that key trigger that's a little bit different from what the federal government's looking at. And they obviously want engineering controls to be implemented first as they take a look at PPE as well. A few other areas to take a look at for indoor workplaces that are affected by outdoor temperatures, trained supervisors, and how to check weather reports. So again, that's additional burdens on the supervisors that are being placed there. Again, that's on California. The links there for those in the states can go through a bit more detailed. I did receive a question: how do safety rules affect people working from home, heat, workplace safety, etc.? Not an attorney. I mean, dust off a few cobwebs. There are requirements in the home with cords and cables and things like that related to OSHA. If it's the employer-directed workspace, you're a sole proprietor, it's a little bit different. In the case of heat, I don't want to give you incorrect information, but the federal OSHA did put out in its backgrounder to the small business community last August 6th, I believe it was. It does have a section on working from home. I believe on that as well. I just did not honestly go through it as much for that, but we can certainly get that answer for you as well, because this is here, the timing of it is important. Since our last discussion, OSHA has officially completed its proposed rule. And again, the apprenticeship rule is a final rule. This one on heat is a proposal, and that has been completed and has been sent over to OIRA, again, the White House, for interagency review. You can see as of now, there are meetings scheduled through July 15th. I've spoken to some of the folks going in on those meetings and requesting them and getting a sense and making sure some of our voices are heard in addition to the efforts that we've done in the past. What this could potentially mean is we might see a OSHA rule coming out on heat for indoor and outdoor workplaces at 80 Fahrenheit sometime. But my estimation is going to be Labor Day. It makes for good politics and timing for the administration to do it then. Sticking with OSHA, a few more here. OSHA translation services are being offered in accordance with an executive order that was issued. So vital information that is written, oral, digital, that's critical for obtaining federal services, benefits required by law. You may request language assistance. So just to make this aware that they've added additional languages and trying to be helpful to individuals, and you can submit a translation request for some of those documents that are vital for security, for safety, and some other areas as well. And that was just posted. This is just a warning. Every few years we'll see this. This is for the Southeast region of the U.S. The Department of Labor, OSHA, just yesterday rather, held a briefing on, or webinar rather, on whistleblowers for employers, workers, and others as they continue to rely on individual employees to trigger OSHA inspections. This is part of the administration's outreach on that one. This is a reminder with an asterisk. Today is June the 28th, and where we look at the issues moving forward, we have on July 1st taking effect the overtime rule. As a reminder, there is a federal overtime rule that the federal government has finalized and is going to start taking effect here on July 1st, where it's going to increase to $35,568 per year, meaning any full-time executive, administrative, professional, clerical employee, full-time salaried employees. If you're full-time salaried, that time and a half is going to go up from $35,568 to $43,888 on July 1st. The asterisk here is there are several courts that are going to be reviewing it, and there is some in the employer community that are looking and hoping that over the weekend here, courts do step in the next 48 hours and block this from taking effect. But please make sure HR, the payroll, others are fully aware of this for your full-time salaried employees. Our surveys tell us we have roughly about 10% FTEs would be affected potentially by this rule, certainly when fully implemented as well. As we look forward and outside of OSHA, a few requirements. This is one of the questions I get more and more often is on cybersecurity and CMMC. CMMC was largely based on NIST 800-171, and this is the most recent revision, was just completed a few weeks ago. And we just want to put out there that requiring and the protection of controlled unclassified information, there's additional procedures and security requirement and assessments by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NIST, and that is the agency here in Washington, D.C. So you're going to start seeing updated NIST 800-171 requirements, and if you are in a federal contract or other agreement or engagement with a federal agency or a subcontractor thereof, this is separate from CMMC, but is similarly related. Make sure someone in compliance that deals with, if you mention NIST 800 to somebody that deals with cyber in your shop, they'll know what you're talking about and just pass this along to them. On the R&D side, for you CFO, CPA types, just a heads up that what might be coming, that the Department of Treasury and the IRS are looking at moving forward with an updated form that they want to use for research and development activity credits, qualified research expenses, that's what a QRE is. And so taxpayers that would be claiming reduced payroll credit, payrolls and credit and so on, the QREs, 1.5 million in gross receipts, 50 million. So there's different components and reporting requirements, and the changes will be coming for next year. Again, if somebody that does your taxes should know this, but just a heads up in case it affects any of your current activities for the 2024 year as you start thinking about moving forward. 2 quick slides, most of you already in the industry would be aware of this, but for others as well, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration on the CAFE fuel economy standards has come out for passenger and light trucks, and that is going to be a 2% increase for model years 27 through 31. and they want to get a miles per gallon 50.4 industry-wide fleet average by model year 2031, and that's on the passenger and the light truck. But on the heavy duty, that's at 2.851 gallons per 100 miles is the industry-wide fleet average that they're looking for by model year 2035. They slipped that a little bit from the initial proposals that they had put forward. These are both final, is what they accepting unless there's any challenges to it. But for those of you in industry, start thinking through how that affects you, particularly on model year 27, which is already, well, here in terms of production and design and many for some makes and models and manufacturers. EPA, for you folks down in Texas area, DFW, Houston, so Harris County, Galveston, San Antonio are being reclassified as being non-attainment zones under the current OZA standard. And what that does is it's going to require the metro areas and the state itself to implement more stringent emission control strategies in order to attain that 2018 National Ambient Air Quality Standards. It's called an NAAQS for ozone. And that was something that was lowered by the Obama administration back then, although some wanted to go even further, and have been pushing the Biden administration to lower it even before those and get it down about 60 parts per billion and even 65 from, I think it's at 70 right now. Also over at the IRS, this is the never-ending saga of the employee retention tax credit. Was in a meeting the week before last with the chairman of the tax writing committee and a call with him this morning at 9 o'clock. And this ERC thing, the longer that we don't get a Senate action on the tax bill that John mentioned, the less value we could potentially get out of ERC if they shift the dates on it. The employee retention credit, which many of you use, this is pretty blaring here, that the IRS, the head, Dane Werfel, said that up to 90% of these are at risk of being fraudulent, of these claims that are there, saying 10 to 20% of claims fall into what the agencies determine a high risk group, which show clear signs rather of being erroneous claims. And then in addition to those up to 20%, another 60 and 70% of the employee retention credit claims that stemmed from the COVID era show an unacceptable level of risk. So they're really only clearing 10 to 20. For those of you that are in the 10 to 20% that still have not received your refund and are in those already classified as legitimate claims internally, you wouldn't know, then they're trying to push those out more quickly. And they anticipate some of the first payments going out later this summer. And that is an update for those of you that are still sitting on it and still waiting. Sounds like if you're waiting one way or another, you're going to be hearing from them. If you believe you might be in that 60 to 70%, there was a grace period that I believe closed 2 months ago, but still worth speaking with the CPA on that as well. Also, sticking with the IRS and your partnerships, there's a big focus on partnerships over there on basis shifting. That's effectively where a taxpayer is reducing and shifting some of its assets from one of the businesses that they own that's not generating enough tax benefits, and then they're moving it over the assets owned to another business that they own, so that way it can generate some tax benefits there without really changing much of the economics of it and some of the issues and some of the challenges there. A few other things to look through as we go through on taxes as well. And that's the one that we take a look at. On trade, tariff, supply chains, and then we'll talk some Supreme Court and then get ready to wrap it up there. And on the executive order on the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience, this was just released a couple of weeks ago, and this formalizes the Supply Chain Council that the White House created under an executive order previously. What they're also doing is they're asking that the agencies work together and through the council to submit a report to the president on supply chain resiliency and economic security and industries critical to industry, and have those sent over, the first draft coming no later by the end of the year, and then also doing it every 4 years. So that's something we've been talking about for quite some time. And it started with Trump and with us, especially, and other groups pushing as well with this administration. And so they really are looking at supply chain resiliency throughout the entire, throughout manufacturing and I think all agencies and all government actions there as well. On the trade side, we want to keep looking at 301 and where that ends up being in the pecking order. As we mentioned in the last month, the White House and the U.S. Trade Representative had completed their review of the Section 301 tariffs on China that Trump had put in place starting in July of 2018. Those are 25 and 7.5% tariffs on over 10,000 imports from China that Biden has left untouched largely until now. Biden, as we reported previously, is going to increase the tariffs on autos, electric vehicles from China, and a number of other goods from at least 25% to 100% range, depending on the import coming from China. And that's going to start phasing in here over the next year and two. And from that standpoint, in addition to those, they're conducting a review where they're allowing companies through today to submit comments on that action, on whether or not to increase some tariffs or keep the others. And then also on the 312 imports from China that they're making eligible for an exclusion. Comments on those products are due today. Please see our last webinar dated May 31st, and you'll see a table of some of the relevant items in there coming in from China that might be eligible potentially for an exclusion request from the administration as you look forward to. As the USTR is moving in a number of different spaces on trade and supply chains. As I mentioned, the Supply Chain Resiliency Council was formalized by the White House. The U.S. Trade Representative last month also did hold a hearing, and they heard from 84 witnesses, some virtual, some in person, with regards to supply chains and different initiatives and how trade policy can be used to strengthen domestic supply chains and improve resiliency there. So that shows that's part of, again, that whole of government, and they are actively moving forward. And I had a conversation with USTR last Monday where they are looking at transshipment from China through Mexico in particular of products that aren't actually manufactured down there as well. One issue that doesn't receive as much attention as you probably should from compliance folks is on forced labor and prevention, particularly with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that one that is certainly trickling down through supply chains. Just a flag, they listed 6 companies recently as violating the forced labor from goods coming in from China, for 68 base companies, but really 6 categories rather. One of the categories did include an aluminum manufacturer, the one that's listed here, and you can get a sense of the continued enforcement that is expected from the administration there. In the last couple of minutes, we wanted to spend a little bit of time on Supreme Court decisions. Again, not attorneys, so you will certainly want to seek guidance. I know the team over at Bracewell, when they do receive the analysis from their legal team, they'll be sure to post that and get that out as well. And I strongly encourage you to read their interpretations. Let's just start with the biggest one of the day, and that is something that is referred to as the Chevron deference. The Chevron deference dates back to 1984 when the current Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch's mother was running the EPA. And basically, in effect, since then, the Chevron deference has pretty much just allowed judges to defer to the agencies and their expertise, and effectively saying that the judges aren't the ones that have the expertise in these different regulatory issues, and that if it's not spelled out strictly in a statute, then you should defer to the agencies and they should do it. And the expectations, as one of the dissenting judges wrote today, is you can't expect that Congress is going to write every law exactly perfect and with all of that expertise, and that's why they do defer over to the agencies. And so in this 6-3 ruling that came down today, which is very, very significant for all of those regulations that we just came down in, Chief Justice Roberts, he wrote the opinion, and I'll give you a few quotes, where they argued that it defies the command of the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs federal administrative agencies. He said, quote, "It requires a court to ignore, not follow, the reading the court would have reached had it exercised an independent judgment as required by the Administrative Procedures Act," meaning that he believes the Chevron deference, as it's called, defers too much to those agencies and does not allow the courts to, on their own, issue a ruling. This is a major shift in power that is going to give federal judges a lot more power over and greater discretion to invalidate agency actions. And while he said it was, quote, misguided, that agencies have no special competence in resolving statutory ambiguities, courts do. And that's why that ruling is so important, is that now that could potentially gut a number of cases. This is not retroactive, so you're going to have to see court cases brought and challenged with parties that have standing to make it through the court system to begin charging, alleging some of these rules and statutes that are, rules that are put in place by OSHA, NLRB, and others, that they are not able to stand on their own. So again, this was done in 2 different court decisions that came down today. One of them was dealing with a bunch of fishermen, fish industry folks that were being required by the federal government to purchase certain monitoring and tracking devices with their own money and install them as well. And that was why that was fought and that was upheld, that one. And then there's also a similar case as well. This is very significant. We'll have more information on that from the attorneys, but from a regulatory standpoint, this was the most consequential of the week. The courts, also the Supreme Court, for those of you that aren't familiar, in the last 2 weeks, usually of June, the Supreme Court releases most of its consequential decisions ahead of its summer break before beginning the October term, coming in a few months, and we might see Supreme Court Justice announce a retirement here over the summer if she gets enough pressure from Democrats, is what sources are saying. Also, the mandatory repatriation tax that was upheld, and this goes to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed under former President Trump. It's important to not read too much into this for either side, Republicans, Democrats, opponents, supporters, as it was more of a narrow decision that was written out. It was either Kavanaugh or Gorsuch that wrote it. And in the narrow decision, really only focuses on shares that are owned by an American in a foreign corporation. So it's not about repatriating all funds, and it's not also invalidating the IRS's ability to tax unrealized income. Basically, it came down to a couple that had invested $15,000 or something like that in a company in India that supplies farmers over there with certain technological tools. And they never realized any of the income because it never got repatriated to the United States, but it kept increasing. That company would just use their profit to reinvest in the business. Well, the US government was taxing them on this under the TCJA, and that was how this court. So this is important to follow as well, particularly for some of you that might have ownership overseas and bringing that back home. Also, on the significant regulatory side, on the good neighbor, there is a provision within the Clean Air Act that's generally referred to as the good neighbor provision. Think of it as this, that you're getting pollution from one state flowing downwind to another state, and that is infringing on that downwind states and upwind states. So the good neighbor provision of the Clean Air Act requires upwind states to reduce emissions that affect the air quality in downwind states. The Supreme Court yesterday temporarily blocked the rule that was issued by the EPA that was going to reduce the pollution from power plants and other industrial facilities in 23 states as part of that good neighbor block. It was a 5-4 ruling on that. Again, it doesn't fully shut it down, but it does put the rule on hold while a challenge to it continues in the Federal Court of Appeals there in DC. So that's something else to watch from the regulatory, since the regulatory agencies took quite the beating this week from the Supreme Court. Similarly, this is one behind the scenes that is very significant, and for attorneys in DC, look at this very often. Most people don't realize this, but that some federal agencies have their own internal judicial system where they'll adjudicate for you, and there really is no recourse for you to appeal much further beyond what that agency tells you to do. And that can often be an interpretation of a dispute between you and that federal agency. They're called administrative law judges. And the Supreme Court also just ruled that the use of an internal administrative law judge to seek civil penalties violates the constitutional right to a jury trial. So some of the agencies that use these administrative law judges include the Department of Labor, the EPA, OSHA, SBA, NLRB, among others. Again, another very consequential decision that was put forward there. One that I don't have on here, though, is we're just referred to as a Sackler decision related to the Sackler family and the owners of OxyContin. The Supreme Court said that they blocked that rule on the liability protection for the Sackler family, saying that they are not immune. So there's going to be repercussions beyond that in terms of ownership of a business that could be held liable, and the liability of the owners themselves. So that's something else to watch closely. On that, as we get ready to wrap up here on membership support, a couple things we did want to flag for you and turn it over to Caitlin. Kind of bring us back here on some media and a few things, because again, media has been extremely helpful.
Sure. One more media story to highlight. This is a media clip from May, but I don't think we covered it in our last webinar. We've been talking a lot, both here and on our podcast. Quick plug for the podcast, our Talking with One Voice show, about the potential change in administration, what that might mean on the policy from a policy perspective. One place where we all know there's remarkable alignment is on tariffs. This was an AP story. AP, of course, major news outlet in its own right, but also AP stories, Associated Press stories are picked up and placed in outlets all over the country. Jeff Asnavorian kindly and smartly did this interview. Certainly appreciate his cooperation on it, because it's a really interesting story about where there's overlap in the both parties' position on tariffs. Good story, but also important for One Voice being seen as an opinion leader on the issue, NTMA and PMA members having their voices heard about the implications of tariffs on the manufacturing industry in the US. So good story, good effort by Jeff to participate. And, just another plug, Jeff and Allison, both who I've mentioned are media volunteers. We have lots of opportunity, and certainly in an election year, there's tons of opportunity and interest from members to do interviews. It's good to hear from lobbyists, it's good to hear from policymakers, but really media often wants to hear from the people who are, out in the field doing the work. That's really what drives news coverage. So thank you to them for doing this. And, hopefully you all see it as this is part of our effort, right, to speak about policy issues. Oh, and here you go. Here's the little slide. I just mentioned the podcast, Talking with One Voice. You can get it wherever you find your podcast. And if you don't yet subscribe to it, please do, so that you can get the show right onto your device. Rate and review us too, so other people can find it.
Absolutely. And to that point, since we did get a question on this, and rightfully so, I know everyone's burning to hear it with regards to what happened with the debate last night and our thoughts. You will be certainly getting a lot of our thoughts on the debate or on the podcast that we're going to record this coming Tuesday. So over the holidays, you will certainly be able to hear some of our thoughts, our takes on the debate that happened last night, and some of the analysis moving forward from both what Democrats and Republicans are thinking, both here and around the country as well. As always, please do be supportive in any way that you can, and continue to do so, of both the NTMA and PMA's advocacy funds. Without this, we would not be able to do all this work. We've said we've got a lot on our plate between taxes, trade, obviously on OSHA heat rule coming, apprenticeships rule. Supreme Court decisions are going to have a significant impact on our strategies moving forward. Please do type in any questions. Feel free to reach out to us. Anything that we can do to clarify, to answer any of these. Our next one, anybody types in any last minute questions or thoughts here, our next webinar is going to be on Friday, August the 1st at 12 p.m. Eastern, as we always do. Again, encourage you all to reach out to Christy at PMA or to Jenny at NTMA with anything further that you all need, or to us directly. Seeing no questions come through, thank you all for joining us today. Again, please do download the podcast next week when it's posted, and the latest on the debate and what's happening in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you.